Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us for this SHRN webinar. My name is Dr. Caitlyn Donaldson. I'm a Research Associate at DECIPHer at Cardiff University. And I'm going to talk today about a piece of research that I've done looking at young people's mental health and well-being across the transition from primary to secondary school, but with a particular focus on a measure of school environment that I've used within the analysis. So I'm just going to start by saying why I think school transition is important, both for me as a researcher, but also for teachers and schools and for young people. So firstly, there's evidence that it may be particularly difficult for some groups of young people to navigate the primary to secondary school transition. While for a lot of young people, it's a really positive experience and they're really excited about moving up to secondary school, there are groups of young people who might find it more difficult. And we know that young people who have additional learning needs and also young people with lower levels of socioeconomic status may find the transition more difficult than other children. Secondly, transition points are particularly important for interventions. They offer a really good opportunity for us to intervene to support young people's mental health. That's transition points more broadly, actually. So when any of us go through transitions in our lives, those moments where we're a bit uncertain and maybe a bit anxious can be real opportunities for change. So we can use school transition potentially as an opportunity to intervene to support young people. And then finally, in a relatively recent piece of research, young people were asked about what they thought should be priorities for young people's mental health research. And they put supporting young people at times of transition as one of their top 10 research priorities. And that included the transition from primary to secondary school. So it's something that young people recognise as being really important for their mental health. So just to give a bit of background, just to sort of a theoretical basis for what I'm going to present, I like to think of school transition as being a little bit like the high jump. So you have a run-in period, as you do with the high jump. So young people from as early as maybe year 5 are starting to be aware that they're going to be transitioning into their secondary school. They start to get involved in activities that might support that process. You obviously have the in year 6 where they start applying for their secondary schools. And with that can come a certain level of anxiety, particularly for young people who are unclear about which school they might be attending. And they're waiting for those results to know whether or not they've got into their first choice school. So you have this run-in period, this lead-in period, where young people are starting to think about that change and starting to maybe visit schools and take part in transition activities. You then have that moment where they start their new schools, they sort of transition over the bar, cross the bar, high jump bar, where they first experience that new environment. So they first start to experience the new physical environment. They realise there are new academic expectations on them. They start to build new peer relationships and new relationships with their teachers as well. And then you have that landing period where they start to adapt and to negotiate those changes in their new school. And that can take a certain amount of time. That may not happen quickly. That might happen through year 7, maybe even into year 8, that they start to develop that connectedness to their new school. So what I'd like to propose is that young people come to that school transition with different levels of resources. I don't think that'll come as any surprise to anybody. So young people come with different levels of resources. So those resources might be things like self-esteem and social support, self-efficacy, so that belief that they can do what they set out to achieve. And you can think about that in terms of the high jump as if young people are stood on boxes. So young people with more resources, they're close to that high jump bar. They're likely to find that transition process more straightforward than young people who have fewer resources and are lower down and further away from the bar. And the more resources you have, the more ability you have to be able to cope with transition related stress. And you can imagine how this might introduce inequality into transition experiences, because not all young people are starting off in the same place. But then you also have the other option of potentially lowering that bar so that it doesn't matter so much what resources you come to transition with. Transition can be more straightforward for you. So if you can lower the bar, and that's at the school level, so if schools are able to create an environment that is more supportive of young people and more conducive to them having a successful transition, then young people actually need fewer resources to start with, and potentially there's less inequality then in experiences over transition. Transition becomes less stressful for everybody. So that's the kind of theoretical basis for which I'm going to talk about this particular project. So this analysis used 2 linked surveys. So it used the secondary SHRN data, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with, and it was data from 2019. But it was linked to CHETS data. So CHETS was a survey, it's a bit of a precursor really to primary SHRN that was used to pilot how we would run surveys in primary schools. And CHETS was run in the spring-summer term of 2019. And then we had secondary SHRN in the autumn of 2019. So we had some of the CHETS children would have been the same children taking part in secondary SHRN. And so we were able then to link the data. So young people who responded in primary school could be linked to their responses in secondary school. And we were able to do that for 506 students from 59 primary schools who then transitioned into 51 secondary schools. And these were all young people who'd experienced quite a sort of a typical transition. So they'd gone with the bulk of their cohort from primary schools. Young people who'd gone into secondary schools as sort of 1s and 2s have been excluded from this analysis. So these are children who've moved up with the bulk of their cohort into their new secondary school. And in the CHET survey, we had some pre-transition measures of mental health. So that was the Me and My Feelings questionnaire, which is now used in primary SHRN. So we have a measure of emotional difficulties and a measure of behavioural difficulties from year 6. And they were also asked whether they were worried about transition. So we have that measure as well. And then from secondary SHRN, we had post-transition measures of mental health. So we had the Strengths and Difficulties questionnaire. And in this analysis, it's used as the total difficulty score, but also we use 2 subscales. So the emotional difficulty subscale and the conduct problem subscale from that. We also had a measure of socioeconomic status using the family affluence scale. And we had some school connectedness measures, which were measured at the individual level. So young people were asked whether they felt like they belonged at their school, whether they felt that their ideas were taken seriously, and also whether they felt that their teachers care about them. And so we had those 3 measures of school connectedness that were from year 7. And then we also had a school level measure of the percentage of children within the school who were eligible for free school meals. But then in order to develop a measure of school environment, we had to go outside of these pupil surveys. And the measure that has been developed is kind of termed a measure of meaningfulness. And the question it sort of seeks to answer or to uncover is whether or not the school meets the students' aspirations for personal and social development. So if a school is meaningful for young people, it will meet those aspirations. And if young people feel that those aspirations for personal and social development are being met, they are more likely to attend school and they're more likely to do better academically in school because school is meaningful to them. So that's the idea behind this measure. So how did we produce this meaningfulness measure? So we weren't able to use the pupil survey data for this and had to look outside of it. So Stats Wales collate the annual census data for schools, and so that's the data that we use. It's freely available online and can be accessed. So we had complete data for 199 out of 205 secondary schools in Wales. The main reason that we didn't have complete data for a school was because it was a new school and so didn't have GCSE data yet that we could use. And we were able to then take data on a number of variables for each school. Firstly, attendance data, so the percentage of half days attended within the school, that's the 5-year average. Attainment data, so Stats Wales reports on the capped 9 points score, which is a score produced based on GCSE results within the school. The percentage of students eligible for free school meals, that's the 3-year average within the school. The percentage of female students in a school. We also used the school postcode to look at the ranking of that postcode, of that community around the school on the Welsh Index of Multiple Deprivation. So that provided another measure of socioeconomic status of the community around the school. The percentage of ethnic minority students in the school, and also the percentage of students with special educational needs. And this was special educational needs rather than additional learning needs because this is 2019 and that was how it was reported then. So what you do is you take all of that data and you use the attendance data and the attainment data as outcome data. So you're going to try and predict those two outcomes using these other characteristics of the school, these other demographic characteristics of the school. And when you take all of the data, so the 199 schools, you can use those as predictors to create essentially a line of best fit through the data that says, given any school's particular demographic characteristics, this is what you would predict their attendance or attainment to be. So this line predicts that attendance or attainment for each of the schools. However, we have the specific data for each of those schools, so we can see whether a school's attendance data or whether a school's attainment data actually fits or sits above that line of best fit or below that line of best fit. So schools that have their data sits above the line of best fit, we can say are doing better than you would expect or you would predict given their demographic characteristics. And schools whose data sits below that line of best fit are doing worse than you would predict based on their demographic characteristics. And what we can do is take that difference between where you'd expect them to be on the line and where they actually are, and that's called the residual. And we take that for each of the models. So we take that for the attendance model and the attainment model, and we sum them and standardize them. And that produces a measure of schools' meaningfulness within this context. So whether or not they're doing better or worse than you would expect for those two outcomes. And that's what's been produced, and that's what's shown in this graph here, which suggests the data is relatively normally distributed. So you have some schools sitting at either ends of the tail, but most schools are in the middle of the bell curve. And so every school has this score of meaningfulness, this meaningfulness score, that we can then merge into the pupil level data, and we can use within our models when we're looking at predicting young people's mental health in year 7. So this slide provides the sample characteristics that we had within the young people. So 506 young people were linked across the primary to secondary school surveys. Just over half of those were girls, so 54% were girls. 84% of the young people had white British ethnicity, and about 2/3 of them said that they lived with both parents. And we had a relatively even split between low, medium and high family affluence groups, about 1/3 of young people in each. So in terms of the methods, in terms of the actual analysis, we use multi-level modelling to look at the relationship between a series of covariates and a series of outcome variables, mental health outcome variables. So the outcome variables were the Strengths and Difficulties questionnaire, total difficulty score. So that was based on summing the 4 subscales of emotional difficulties, conduct problems, hyperactivity and peer problems. So a total difficulty score. But we also used the emotional difficulties subscale and the conduct problem subscale separately. And also the Short Warwick Edinburgh mental wellbeing scale, which is a positively worded scale that is used to measure young people's mental wellbeing. And all of those outcome variables were measured in year 7 post-transition. Then we had a series of year 6 covariates measured pre-transition, so gender, also pre-transition emotional difficulties, pre-transition behavioural difficulties, and whether or not young people were worried about transition. We then had some other covariates from year 7. So we used the family affluence scale from year 7 to assess socioeconomic status. And then we had 3 questions around school connectedness. So whether young people felt they belonged at school, whether their teachers care about them, and whether they felt their ideas are taken seriously. And then we had finally 2 school level covariates. Both of these are based on the secondary school. So we had the percentage of young people eligible for free school meals within the school. And we also had this measure of meaningfulness at the school level. So what were the key findings from the analysis? So first of all, at the individual level, what we found was the most consistent predictor of post-transition mental health was pre-transition mental health. So young people who were struggling in year 6 were significantly more likely to be struggling in year 7 than young people who weren't struggling in year 6. We found that the overall total difficulty scores and well-being in year 7 were significantly predicted by family affluence. So young people who were from less affluent families had significantly higher total difficulties and significantly lower well-being in year 7. We also found that being worried about transition in year 6 was a significant predictor of emotional problems in year 7. In terms of the school connectedness items, sense of belonging, we found that it was significantly associated with well-being in year 7, total difficulties and emotional problems. So a higher sense of belonging was associated with higher well-being and lower total difficulties, lower emotional problems. Young people who perceived their teachers to care about them had higher, significantly higher well-being in year 7 and significantly lower conduct problems, as well as significantly lower total difficulties. And young people who perceived that their ideas were taken seriously in school had significantly higher well-being, significantly lower total difficulties and significantly lower emotional problems in year 7. So the final finding and the key one really that I wanted to talk about was around meaningfulness. So what we found was that meaningfulness was significantly associated with mental well-being in year 7, but it wasn't associated with mental health difficulties. So that's either the total difficulty score or the emotional problems or conduct problem subscales. So what we found was that young people in high meaningfulness schools who had high meaningfulness scores had significantly higher mental well-being in year 7 than young people who were in low meaningfulness scores. You have to be a little bit careful interpreting this. The nature of the analysis means we can't infer causality. So we can't say for sure that it is the school environment that is causing the mental well-being outcomes in the young people. And the effect might run in the opposite direction or it might run in both directions. However, if we think about it, in order for it to run in the opposite direction, we're suggesting that high well-being in year 7 students is resulting in a higher school meaningfulness score. This is a little bit problematic because firstly, the meaningfulness score is based on the whole school, not just in year 7. So it's based on attendance attainment across the whole school. It's based on the demographic characteristics across the whole school. So what you're really suggesting when you say that higher well-being is creating higher meaningfulness within the school, you're actually saying that it's the whole school has higher well-being than would be expected given other characteristics, and that it's this that's creating the high meaningfulness score. However, in reality, given that we've controlled for many of the demographic characteristics within the meaningfulness measure that might explain why a school would have very high well-being, so for example, potentially having a lot of children from very affluent backgrounds, so very low levels of free school meals, perhaps might explain a school that has particularly high well-being. However, those measures have been included within the meaningfulness measure and within the regressions that have been run. And so what you're left with is a group of young people who have potentially high well-being, but the only thing really in common with them is the school itself that they attend. So you sort of end up back where you started, with the school environment potentially helping to influence the mental well-being of the students. So definitely more work needs to be done to look at this and to understand to what extent this runs in each direction. But I think there is a strong case to suggest that the school environment in this scenario is having an impact on young people's mental well-being in year 7. So what are the implications for this finding? Well, I think it's useful first of all to think about what we mean by mental well-being. And Carol Reif, who's an academic from the US, has done a lot of work in this field, and she says that mental well-being is about self-acceptance, purpose in life, autonomy, environmental mastery, personal growth and positive relationships. And so it suggests that a meaningful school may provide more of all of these things. So it may provide greater purpose in life for young people, greater opportunities for autonomy, greater opportunities for personal growth, for building positive relationships, for feeling that they have mastery over their environment, and therefore create higher well-being. And so to draw on the analogy of the high jump, perhaps a school that is meaningful is lowering that high jump bar for young people as they transition into it. It's meeting their aspirations for personal and social development. And in doing so, it's making it easier for them to connect to the school environment and to develop a sense of belonging. So that leads on to the kind of next obvious question, really, which is how can schools be more meaningful? So if we go back to the original question that meaningfulness poses, which is, does school meet students' aspirations for personal and social development? So if a school is able to meet those students' aspirations, then students will perceive it as being meaningful for them. And so we need to align the school aspirations with student aspirations in terms of both attainment. So what is it that young people want to achieve academically from school? Is it that they want to get certain GCSE results, or is it that there are practical skills that they want to learn? And also around values, around relationships with others. So if we can align what the school is trying to achieve for its students with what is important to its students, then students will find that to be meaningful. And this links really closely to the whole school approach, because ultimately, in order to understand student aspirations, we need to talk to students and we need to find out what it is that's important to them. And so the whole school approach is, very clear about the importance of student voice, also the importance of engaging with parents and community, because the sort of the home culture, the aspirations of a community and of parents is also really key to understanding what it is that students want from school. There's obviously a really, important leadership is obviously really important to this as well, as is staff well-being, because staff who feel their well-being is low and are struggling are not in a position to be able to give more of themselves towards this. And I think Markham, who I've cited here, also talks a lot about valued school identities, which is, I think, a really interesting point. The idea being that within school, what are the identities of young people that are valued? Are schools valuing young people who have skills in a broad range of areas? Maybe their skills are social rather than academic. Or are we saying that actually the kids that we value are the ones who are really strong academically, or the ones that are really good at sport, or the ones that are really good at music? And he highlights the importance of having a really broad range of valued school identities, so that young people, irrespective of what they're good at, feel that they belong, feel that they can connect to school, and that is really important for their mental health as well.